Raj has got a residency in this room, I figured out earlier.
Yeah, hopefully I'm doing a good job. Just before we start, there's a QR code here. It is, or you can just take a picture of my head, that's fine. And then you can ask any questions that you like to. Perfect. Robert.
Yes.
Very excited to chat with you. Can we start with the most important question? Why should anyone here give a shit about TradFi?
Because this is probably the wrong metaphor, but the famous US bank robber, I forget his name, Willie, what's his second name? Anyway, he said, well, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is. So essentially, I think the way, and the serious answer to your question, Roger, is that when you think about what's happening is all the technology is kind of here in DeFi at one side. All the money is over in TradFi, and by definition, we have legacy technology, ways of thinking, everything. And really, the job of all of us is really building, and this is exactly what we're doing at Franklin Templeton, is building bridges between the two. So we've got to get the capital. Essentially, any economy is really all about capital flow. It's about the flow of capital, the creation of capital, and the allocation of that capital. And so there's the real tendency to think in terms of product all the time, but really that road to the future that we're all building together in our different ways, product is part of it, but really it's about infrastructure, it's about regulation, it's about processes, and it's about education, as your previous sort of panelist was talking about. And just focusing on how can we build a product isn't going to make it work. And the other part of that equation is that even when you have a superior technology, it doesn't take over overnight. So Betamax was better than VHS. Think about ETFs in the sort of traditional world. They were around and index funds, they were around in the 70s. So it takes time, and the job of all of us really is to accelerate that future, bring that future forward through all different ways. So the answer to your question is, that's where the money is. We've got to stop treating them as the enemy and treat them as users.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for engaging in that question. Listen.
We didn't script that, by the way, so these are all... he's just throwing zingers at me, and I'm going to try and hit him back.
I'll try to throw a couple more. Okay, so I've worked in traditional finance.
Yep.
My last many years have been focused on digital finance overall. Mm-hmm. I was having this discussion with several folks here throughout the day yesterday that the kind of move towards digital finance is not dissimilar than the move towards blockchain in total if you're thinking about a traditional financial institution. I mean, Franklin Templeton has been around for, I don't know, 85, 100, 185,
getting on, yeah.
785 years.
Something like that,
yeah.
Whatever.
How do you guys think about, at Franklin Templeton, kind of that distinction between absorbing blockchain as a new technology versus just your generalized digital roadmap? Like, are these things intertwining, or are you thinking about them as separate initiatives?
They're completely intertwined in that I think the more that you understand about the technology and the more that you understand about the strategic challenges of the traditional industry, so the whole financial industry and the investment industry in particular, the more you realize how different the future is going to be. So they can't be separate. At the same time, you can't just wait for this sort of nirvana, this future with glitter and rainbows and unicorns, and when kind of insert your favorite technology here has dominated the world. And so you have to think of those two things together. The trouble with a large organization is that control is so important that it's really hard to get out of your own way to be able to do all these things. So there shouldn't be any distinction, and we work very hard for there not to be, but in reality, there's always going to be a distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, so I come from a world, again, in fintech building and adoption. Again, I spent a lot of years in that where, and maybe this was kind of we own this point of view, so we kind of accepted it as truth, which is that the reason that banks started to build and adopt digital products was because financial technology applications built them, and those applications solved consumer needs much more effectively than some of the traditional financial institution solutions did. And so that was really what spurred, I think, tremendous investment across the board from financial institutions. So like last year, JP Morgan announced a $1 billion investment in building out their digital infrastructure for their mobile banking services. I mean, those are really positive solutions that have driven excellent solutions for consumers. And so my sense has been that financial institutions have oftentimes lagged what has happened in the industry and have kind of done so because market pressures force them. What I see with the way in which Franklin Templeton has really thought about blockchain is actually much more from a leadership point of view, particularly relative to your peers. So I was curious if you can talk to me a little bit about like, what is it about the way in which you guys have approached it that has made you, I think, effectively a leader thinking through exactly this development for all of your customers?
I completely understand the question. I was at Citi for 20 years, so I saw the other side of that fence. I think there are a number of parts to that. There are a number of parts to answer. In that, when you think of traditional incumbent firms, by definition, they're optimized to the status quo. They're invested in the status quo, and so innovation tends to be defensive, if you like. If you're a disruptor, then innovation is offensive. You don't have career risk, you have company risk. I mean, the career risk doesn't matter. So you're solving for a different problem. The difference with Franklin Templeton and why myself and my boss asked to go and work there is that one, being privately controlled gives you a completely different perspective on the world. You're solving for the next generation, not just the next quarter. Secondly, Jenny Johnson, our CEO, used to run ops and tech, so she understands and she completely gets the joke. She understands it, so having that top-down sponsorship and vision. And thirdly, I think when you've built the infrastructure, when you're a builder, as opposed to a tourist is the wrong word, but as opposed to having arm's length involvement, that gives you a very, very different perspective, understanding, view of the world, and that feeds on itself, and you end up doing more and more and more. So I think the difference, to summarize, would be that it's genuine and it goes all the way down as opposed to marketing.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I've seen your CEO, a couple of videos of it, and really, I think, wonderful perspective for sure. When I think about digital innovation, again, coming from my background, one of the things I've seen a lot of financial institutions struggle with on a digital innovation perspective is that they run on legacy tech stacks. And so running on the legacy tech stacks, integrating new capabilities becomes like, it's a foundational problem.
Yeah.
And so you may have a discussion where there's a strategic desire to get into it, but the technical gap is either very large or is something that just gets kicked to the back burner for years and years and years. And I'm curious, and so what you tend to see frequently is a lot of M&A in the space.
Yep.
And M&A will result in purchasing, an incumbent fintech that maybe aligns, generally speaking, to where you want to go. Whereas what I've seen with you guys is actually a real focus on internally innovating. I'm curious, from your perspective, what lessons can other TradFis potentially take from how you've been able to innovate in the space and actually be able to launch off your own tech stack?
It's hard work. It's not about the technology, it's really about the regulation and navigation. I think the more that you're steeped in the technology, I think one thing leads to another. So basically our journey was essentially a realization that the whole financial industry is all about recording who owns what and when the things move around. Obviously, blockchain is very pertinent to that. So when we put a government-regulated money market fund, U.S. government money market fund, on chain, on Stellar, back in 2021. When we went through, the reason we chose a money market fund was that the regulation around it was the hardest and the velocity of transactions were the greatest. So we chose the hardest problem to attack. And then through that journey and through that process, and now I think we're on 10 chains, through that process, you learn how easy it is to take the easy option, and to just duplicate and add cost and complexity. So what I mean by that is that our book of record is the blockchain. It's not a blockchain book of record duplicating the real book of record off-chain, which then gets reconciled at the end of the day, which is very TradFi. The book of record is the blockchain. So when you have the asset in your wallet, you own the asset. So I think that's where there's a lot of, and again, this might be the wrong phrase, there's kind of a lot of sort of Wizard of Oz going on in the traditional industry, trying to use, and which is fair enough, trying to use the technology, but then we have to take the additional step to go from the sort of POCs to actually make it work. And we all talk about real world assets, RWAs. There's not enough talk of sort of RWB, so real world benefits, to the end user. Now, they're different for the individual user from the institution, but your point about integration of legacy sort of tech stacks is that because the transition won't be overnight, what institutions care about is cost. So collateral, the rest of it, that's where the technology will make a difference. It's very different for individuals. It's very fashionable to say that you're a technology company. We're an asset manager. So we manage assets for our clients, and the technology is just a means to that end. But you have to be able to translate that technology into tangible benefits for your clients. Otherwise, it's just, let's say, self-referential.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's super helpful. There's multiple surface areas you touched on, which I want to get into, not the least of which is regulation. I know that I'll be sensitive there. But prior to that, maybe for the audience, I mean, maybe this would be a good time to talk a little bit about, and I know you're going to touch on this on a session later, but specifically your products that you've developed on blockchain, specifically Benji, and maybe how that evolution with launching on Stellar came about from your perspective.
I think, so we originally chose Stellar, and that's our most important chain, because what Stellar allows you to do, it allows you to create features which we think will become essentially industry standards. So the fact you can have multi-sig transaction signing enables you to have a much greater level of security, but it also enables you to have alternative sets of keys for different types of transactions. The trust line architecture, to be able to build in the KYC, the clawback facility, even having a memo field so you can put data in the actual transaction, and so you can generate a readable statement from the on-chain data. Stellar makes all of these things, really important things, very easy, and it's very easy. It's also easy to see how those features, so clawback, trust line, etc. It's difficult not to see them becoming industry standards. And one question that people often ask is, so what can we do to accelerate the future? I think one of those things is really standardization around how we build and what we build. All the function is on the what. There's not much focus on the how.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess to bring home the product piece, and I'm going to claim a relative level of ignorance given my 2+ weeks at SDF. So I apologize for everyone who's like, this question is ridiculous. Okay, let's say I have my money being managed at Franklin Templeton. And now I'm aware of Benji through what mechanism? Like, how are you communicating with your customers, and what is the attraction that you're communicating with? Because these are certainly not the crypto native degen. I mean, this is a traditional person operating at a traditional financial institution. Like, what are you talking about?
Well, it's not. So that's the interesting part of the answer. In the audience, so we have there's institutional Benji, there's a retail Benji, you have an app, some you may have seen. But in terms of our customer base, or actually, let me phrase it in terms of advantages. So for traditional investors, traditional world investors, an on-chain money market fund allows you to pay for things in the digital world. So very obvious. So it's a safe and familiar way to do that. And pays interest, you have full transparency through to the underlying asset. For existing wallet holders, then it enables you to genuinely diversify from your stable coins, because everyone has stable coins and it's not really diversifying going into different stable coins. You also have a choice of sort of interest, of being interest bearing. The other really important point that doesn't come through is that one of the things that Benji allows, because it's on, let's say, 10 chains, is you can move, and this is a very popular use case, move money across chains with no bridging. So we mint and burn on different chains. So in terms of security, that's why it's so popular with, let's say, crypto hedge funds or with sort of Web3 natives and builders, because of its utility, less as a transport mechanism, less as a money market fund. And so I think when you start to see and when you start to think of products' uses, rather than them just falling into the TradFi trap of thinking them just as a product, then you build very differently and you see them very differently.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it's been about 2 years since you guys launched on Stellar. Like, where are the use cases going from your perspective, and therefore where will the product go? What would you love to see happen?
I can't say anything about product. We are exploring opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. I think everything that Franklin is building and everything that Franklin is doing is giving our investors choices, responsible choices for whether it's exposure to a whole new sort of mechanism of capital creation, which is essentially what sort of blockchain is, and capital sharing, or it's ways to gain exposure to growth in the sort of traditional economy. So it's easy to see that a money market fund is almost kind of the most obvious bridge, but the future roadmap will almost certainly involve different ways to give clients exposure to the growth that's happening.
Yeah. Phenomenal. Okay, can we go on to the regulation stuff?
Let's do it.
All right. Okay, so there's a lot of regulation in and around the industry, and you are a highly regulated entity.
Yep.
So, okay, what's the best way to put this? So there's going to be a lot of regulation that drives the way in which tokenization happens, and likely the way in which you guys decided to build Benji as a product.
Yep.
What are, in your mind, the opportunities and challenges to discuss with regulators now that you have what I would deem to be a successful product in market that is leading a lot of financial institutions? Like, what is the thing that should be talked about with regulators going forward?
I think when we were designing Benji and building Benji, we made absolutely sure that the regulator was involved at every step of the journey, and genuinely it was a partnership. And in all honesty, they made us better as well in terms of challenging us and making us make the product better. I think the regulators have a tough job. This isn't a very popular thing to say, but they have a tough job.
I agree.
And actually, my boss, who runs sort of digital assets and sort of our innovation, she's actually the co-chair of the CFTC Committee on Digital Assets. And having that sort of inside-out view, you realize just it's easy to throw stones. It's a really, really hard job to do. So my advice would be, and from our experience, is regulators aren't the enemy. They may feel like that sometimes, but they aren't the enemy. Making them feel comfortable with not just what you're doing, but how you're doing it. And in our experience, in the US at least, they have been extremely keen to learn and to understand in the same way that everybody is. So we've put as much effort into sharing our sort of insights and understanding and learnings with the regulators as we have with our clients. And so I think when you have that mindset shift of realizing it's collaborative, however painful that might be in the short term, that's really the only way forward. So going back to my earlier answer about to your first question, so why should you care about TradFi? You don't have to care about TradFi, but the point is that if that's where all the money is, where there's money, there's regulation. You can opt out of that, but you're choosing between regulation and scale. If you've got a business that doesn't need to scale and you can do your own thing, that's absolutely fine, but there's no avoiding that regulation. And once you accept that, you realize that you have to partner with those regulators and you have to help them and make it a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, I mean, coming out of the financial crisis in 2008, certainly in the United States, the Dodd-Frank rule came forth, and it defined a tremendous amount of regulation. And what we found is that financial institutions became very, very concerned about being 100% compliance at all times with the way, like whenever the regulation hit. And I think that we're at this inflective moment within blockchain where a lot of the regulation has yet to land. There are some aspects of it that are landing. Franklin Templeton, I think, has taken, I think, a very admirable leadership approach. But I've heard from other financial institutions that they really want to wait and see. I guess maybe, can you tell me a little bit about how you guys consider yourselves as potentially a leader as it comes to engaging with regulators so that you're opening up effectively financial institutions broadly to drive? Like, how much importance is that for you guys? How much, how much pride do you guys take in that kind of leadership role?
I think, well, I wouldn't phrase it so much as a leadership role. I think there's a really important mindset sort of difference that's sort of lurking around here, in that in the traditional world, and those of you from TradFi will recognize this, it's really a zero-sum mentality. My win is your loss. If that's what efficient markets are all about. In the DeFi world, there's currently no scarcity, and we're trying to make everything better for everybody, however cheesy that might sound. We're trying to grow the pie. So when you think of, there's no misalignment with doing the right thing and doing the best thing for everybody, with doing the right thing for yourself and the best thing for yourself. And that applies to regulation, it applies to everything, because you're genuinely in a community, and we're going to win or lose together, or we're going to succeed or fail together. So when you see it in those terms, it's less about and it can't be about a firm having leadership. It can be, certain firms can sort of show the way and can show what's possible. And at the same time, the other point that doesn't get sort of really brought out is that different firms are solving for different things. So all asset managers might look the same. They have very, very different businesses. So whatever leadership, we've been first in a lot of things and are first in a lot of things. But that, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, the more that you do, the more that you realize you need to do. So we're a validator, we run, I don't know, probably 30 validation nodes. When you do that, then you realize that you have a responsibility for the health of the system. There's information in there that you can use to the benefit of your investors and for yourself. And it all becomes, what I'm trying to say, it all becomes interlocking. It's not either or, it's both and, but that just sounds really cheesy. Sorry.
I like both and. Also, I'm a dad of 2 girls. I'm cheese all the way through, so I get it. Okay, so that was awesome. I think that's a perfect end note. There's 2 quick audience questions that I'd love to get to really quickly. The first one was around institutional onboarding. I mean, how are you handling it today?
I'm not sure how to answer it.
However you want. Does anyone want to provide clarity?
Let's talk about that offline, given that this is flashing, and I'll come and talk to you afterwards. That's a good question.
Phenomenal. There's one technology question. We'll take it over after this. Robert, this was a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate your perspective, and I'm really excited about where this goes, not just for the people here, but for everyone. So thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody.